Amanda Brown, virtuoso of the legendary indie band the GoBetweens, is today one of Australia's leading screen composers. I met with her in Sydney recently for this interview. Amanda Brown, thanks very much for joining us on Monnet Conversations.
You're very welcome.
Amanda, your TV and film scores have been very widely applauded. From Baby Teeth through to Brazen Hussies, you've won major industry awards. How do you typically approach screen composition?
You typically approach it with the view that there's no project that is the same, and it's a different approach and different mindset for almost every film. And I usually approach each project with abject fear in the beginning, because I feel like maybe there's a bit of imposter syndrome there, and also sometimes the jobs are just completely out of my comfort zone, which is a bit the nature of film music too, and particularly in this country, because in places like Hollywood and Bollywood you get composers specialising in a particular genre, so they'll just write scores for horror films or rom-coms or whatever. But here, because our industry is quite small, we tend to be Jacks and Jills of all trades. So we do a bit of everything. And what that means for film composers is that you can find yourself writing an electronic score or a string quartet score, or I've got a drama series coming up where the director, in theory, wants me to construct the entire score completely from vocals. Mm-hmm. And so whether or not it will end up that way and not be augmented by other instruments, I don't know, but that's the gauntlet that's been laid down.
So how early or how late do you tend to come in on these projects? I mean, if you think of, say, Baby Teeth or Brazen Hussies, were you in on these from very early on, or do you come in, do they give you the project much later and say, now we need the music?
It really varies with film to film again. So with Baby Teeth, that was super inclusive, and I was involved from script stage. So they sent me the script. I was even involved in the casting. Not that right. I really had a casting voice in making the decisions, but I was consulted and privy to some of the auditions, and that was super interesting because it's not usually the remit of the composer to be part of that process. But so that was very inclusive, and I had to be on board early too, because there were two characters in that film who were musicians, so things needed to be organised pre the shoot. So they needed the pieces to be written that they were going to play on screen, and they also needed to be coached to play those instruments convincingly.
So what's a day in the life of Amanda Brown, the composer, like?
A typical day is probably just quite similar to being a writer in a way, because you're just in your room by yourself or in your studio working in isolation all day for long hours, and you have to be you have to be very disciplined, because the schedules are quite punishing. So for something like a TV drama series, typically you only get a week to 2 weeks for a 1-hour episode. And increasingly drama is having more and more music. Right. So it can be a punish. And in places like Hollywood, I think the budgets are a lot bigger, and so they have teams of people to do things. But typically for me, I'm pretty much doing most things myself. If budget allows, I'll get some cues professionally mixed, or I'll hire a studio and record musicians. And I've never had the budget for an orchestra, for example. But yeah, it's really schedule and budget dependent.
Right. And that self-isolation, I mean, obviously lots of people have been doing self-isolation, mostly to do with the pandemic, but it sounds like you're isolated in a lot of that work. You enjoy that? You enjoy working that way?
Look, yes and no. During the pandemic, it was really business as usual for me because I'm so used to working like that anyway.
Yeah.
And I think ideally, in a perfect world, I'd love to be part of a collective of musicians or artists or people that share a sort of a communal studio space, but with our own rooms, because you need that solitude to focus. Mm-hmm. But I kind of miss having that interaction and just banter and all those things that you get from collaboration. And filmmaking is collaborative because, of course, you're collaborating with the director, the editor, the producers, the music supervisor, and so on. But creatively, when it comes to music, I love it when I am working with a co-composer or a mixer who has better skills than I do, or some great musicians.
Yeah. And I'm imagining, that's a big shift from the work that you did earlier in your career in pop music, where it was very, you were playing regularly with other musicians. This has been a big change.
It's a big change because that's sort of almost the opposite. In a band, you're on the road together in close proximity, seeing perhaps a little too much of each other, and you sort of yearn for that solitude. And this is definitely that. But my favourite part of the whole process is when the music is all coming together in the studio with the musicians, and then I'm sitting in the final mix of the film and hearing everything, all the finished sound design, effects, dialogues, everything working as a synchronous whole.
In an interview in Screen Hub, you made some comments about what a composer consists of, which I thought were really interesting. You talked about film TV composer as being sort of part psychologist, part interpreter. And what I thought was especially interesting was the way you contrasted the art of crafting something that is invisible, music, and doing that to undergird something that is visible, what's on screen. Can you tell me more about that? Because I thought it was a very interesting way to frame it.
Yeah, look, I approach film music the way I pretty much approach life and music, which is very instinctive, I guess. And there's a kind of a magic moment when you're writing music to pictures and you can see it's making the film a better piece of art. But I think by the interpreter and psychologist comments, that's really just trying to find a commonality with a director or producer, because most of the time directors aren't musicians, so they can't say to you, I want this to be in 3/4 time in the key of A minor and at 128 BPM, and I want it to sound like, I don't know, George Crumb or something, yes, that they can give you musical reference and examples of other scores, but a lot of the time it's just working out what the film needs and what they're asking for, because that film is their baby too. They've been living it with it for a lot longer than I have, and so I have to do justice to their vision as well.
Last year, you were the first woman to win an industry award for the best original score for Baby Teeth since Elizabeth Drake's work for Japanese Story, and that's 20 years or so ago. What's the deal there, and what do you think can be done to address that gender imbalance now that you've been winning these awards?
Look, I don't think there's really been enough serious academic research devoted to the whys. I certainly have my own theory about why this is, because we know that the gender ratio in tertiary music education is roughly 50-50, women studying composition. But that doesn't translate to working in the professional world after graduating. And with my own experience, I've been doing film music. I graduated in 2000, so I've been doing it for 22 years. And it's really only in the last 4 years that I've made a consistent and decent living from doing it, and feeling like I'm getting to my professional peak. Because it's like any other art form or anything in life, really. The more you practice and do it and work on the job, the better you get. And in those early years, I just didn't get the work consistently. And that's the story for a lot of women. And I think that there's probably manifold reasons for that. I think one is that historically there's not a huge history of women composers. There is, but they're really under the carpet and not recognised, and particularly in the art, music, classical realm, but also in rock and pop music. Women as writers of music is, if you asked a stranger on the street to name 5 women composers, I think they couldn't do that. So there isn't that history there. So I think maybe in the collective mindset of the general public, and certainly directors and the film industry, there was that idea that it was a male job, in the same way that cinematography was thought of as a masculine job.
Right.
And directing to some extent too, but composing is probably one of the least represented areas in regards to women.
You've been proactive in contributing to composing and to the next generation of composers. It seems to me you do a lot of like mentoring and teaching. You said in another interview somewhere, and I quote, that you were raised as a daughter of first wave feminist, reading Germaine Greer. Is that right? Does that kind of do you think there's a feminist sensibility that's shaping your professional orientation and what you're trying to bring to the industry?
Oh, I think that is right. It's feminist perspective has shaped my outlook on life, really, not just my work, but working in an industry where, firstly, in the world of bands, women were also really underrepresented in terms of instrumentalists. Lots of singers, but not many women playing instruments in bands, and then to go into film music as well, where it was really even bleaker for women. I had that strength from, I think, being raised by a single mother, and that first wave feminist idea that you could have a career and you could do anything. And that's such a difference from my mother's generation, where my mum was of that era where, yes, you could have a tertiary education, but women career pathways were basically either teaching or nursing. And yes, there are obviously exceptions, but there just wasn't that old adage of you can't be what you can't see. There weren't many women out there doing varied professions in her era. And I kind of always have that in the back of my mind as it's so important. Visibility is a huge thing. And I have had young women say to me, and to Lindy as well, the drummer in the GoBetweens, in recent years, you were so inspiring to us to see you on the stage playing instruments. We wanted to be you. You're the reason I play drums, or you're the reason I'm interested in film composing. And
Right.
so it's I think it has had an effect, but it's taken a long time to happen.
Well, I'll come to the Go-Betweens in a moment. In terms of, was yours a typical musical childhood for someone that's gone on to be a musician? Were you encouraged by your mother to develop
No.
music? No.
There's nobody in my family who's a musician, and and I didn't have private music lessons or go to a private school or enjoy any of those things. I just was one of those kids who was a bit obsessed with music, and public primary schools in that era, everybody learnt to play the recorder. So that was the only instrument I had, and it just sounds so incredibly geeky to say it, but I used to work out the melodies to Swan Lake and or Tchaikovsky and things like that on recorder.
Wow. Just before we leave screen composition, just in terms, I mean, when I think of screen composition, I think, so this is not thinking of a woman, I'm thinking of a man here, but in terms of thinking about what you do in the Australian context, I was thinking actually of, in the Japanese context, of Ryuichi Sakamoto, who also was in a sense, an unusual pop band. Then he kind of left all that behind and then reinvented himself as a musical composer. But who are your favourite screen composers, and what do you find inspiring?
Well, I do really love Ryuichi Sakamoto. I've always liked his music, from Yellow Magic Orchestra through to all of his film scores are just gorgeous, and they're so melodic and just so sparse and tasteful and Japanese. They're just lovely. When I was starting out, I really admired the music of Michael Danner, who's a Canadian composer, and became known for his use of unusual instrumentation. So he was and still is, a collaborator with the filmmaker Ang Lee, and he so he would incorporate all kinds of left field instruments that hadn't really been used in film scores before. And he's also, like Ryuichi Sakamoto, quite a lyrical, melodic, beautiful writer. I really like his music for the Indian trilogy of films, Fire, Earth and Water. They were a really big influence. And in more recent years, well, just lately, I've been quite getting into electronic scores. So I've been listening to a bit of Giorgio Moroder lately. It's completely other end of the spectrum, but so I'm just finishing up the new Underbelly drama series, and it's the story of Melissa Caddick, the con woman whose foot was found down the south coast.
Right.
And it's such an overblown story of excessive wealth, and kind of reminds me of the 80s in a way. And so sort of quite baroque synthesizer electronic score seemed like the way to go. But yeah, look, there's so many film composers whose music that I like. It's a hard one to narrow down.
Yeah, sure. So I want to go back on the past. In, I guess, 3 different types of past. I want to ask you about sort of just picking the year here, 1989, from after following the release of 16 Lovers Lane, the album that went so close but then didn't get the band there, it didn't get the band to the commercial hit that it was hoping for, and that fans were hoping for. But then in terms of just worldwide tour, supporting REM, and in terms of what your life was like at that point, when the band breaks up at the end of that year, in a sense, finding yourself starting over again, if I could put it like that. And you go back to university and you go off to Australian Film, Television and Radio School. What was that period like? How difficult was it? And how did you cope with those changes? Because I think from the outside looking in, that looks like a momentous amount of change in that period.
Yeah, look, in retrospect it was. But you got to remember that when the band broke up, I was probably only about 24 still. So I think when you're that age, still in your early 20s, you can roll with the punches pretty well, right, and be quite adaptable. And I knew enough that I needed to be educated further if I wanted to keep working in music and be better at it.
Where did that come from, that sense that, okay, I'm going to go off and get more education?
Just because my education it's so haphazard and patchy. I didn't finish high school. I dropped out of high school to go to ballet school and train as a dancer. Then I went back to TAFE and did HSC and started at university, but then dropped out to join the GoBetweens because that seemed like such an amazing out of the blue offer that was too good to turn down. So I'd never finished university either, and I just felt like I needed that formal training and qualification, and I didn't really know where it was going to take me. I just felt like I needed to expand my horizons and knowledge and skill set. And that was a great thing to do. And I think that's also quite a female thing to do, to be honest, because in the few studies that have been done about women screen composers is that most of them are much more highly educated at a tertiary level than their male counterparts. So maybe that's an insecurity thing, or maybe, as I was saying before, you feel like you need all those weapons and training at your disposal to be able to have the confidence and get out there and say, hire me to do this job. Because in filmmaking, there's a lot of money at stake too. I mean, not so much in this country, but there's a lot of stakeholders with various levels of investment. And just sort of cycling back, I think that's another reason why women haven't traditionally been given those jobs, because they don't have the track record, they don't have the history, and have to prove themselves 10 times more than their cocky male counterparts.
So do you feel that was a conscious decision around that time, that you were leaving the world of being in a band and in pop music to then go in this direction, or did that work itself out over time?
Look, to be honest, I don't really think I had a long-term plan. I just had that immediate idea of learning more. And also I had my son around that time. And after spending 2 years at home, I really needed mental stimulation. And so that was another driving force, was to just keep going. And so, yeah, it was, there was no long game plan in sight. But as looking back on things, I think my whole musical career, I never even wanted to be a career musician. It's just been a series of happy accidents and fortuitous circumstances and invitations to do interesting things. And and I've always been up for a challenge, fortunately. And so that served me well, just sort of taking a leap of faith in a way. So, yeah, I didn't have a long-term plan in sight, but I also hadn't completely given up on the idea of playing in bands and rock and roll and performing live.
Yeah.
And in fact, I did do a tour with REM as part of REM in 1994, I think, as part of their Monster tour.
So you would have been at university then?
So I was at university, and it's quite a funny story because I think I was in second year university, and their manager called up and said, can you come over for 2 weeks and we're going to film this tour, this part of the tour, and can you play violin and oboe and sing? And like, they were reproducing all those really big songs from the Out of Time album,
right,
as well as the Monster ones. And actually, and I don't think it sounds arrogant to say this as an aside, I think they were really influenced by the GoBetweens when we toured with them, and the fact that we were incorporating those unusual instruments, because Out of Time was really quite a U-turn for them.
Yeah.
And then, so yeah, of course I said yes, because they're REM and we adore them and they're really fun to work with. And it was just an opportunity to go over and play those huge stadiums, because by that stage it was probably their peak of their popularity. So they were playing to big 30,000 stadiums. And that was an incredible experience just to be able to do that.
Yes.
But I had to get permission from my university professor to leave to do that, to go on tour. Fortunately, they were all really, I mean, they're the music department. They were really cool about it. So, of course, they said yes. They weren't cool enough to make it count towards any assessment or anything like that. But they were fine with it. And, yeah, it was just one of those weird, probably doesn't happen that often in tertiary music courses, but it was a great interlude.
Yeah. So the other year that I wanted to take you back to was the year 2000, which I'm supposing was a challenging year in the sense that the GoBetweens reforming, but with you not being a part of that, and nor Lindy. And I think I read somewhere that you said something along the lines of, I would have liked to have been invited. And I was struck by that because if I'm remembering that correctly, I thought it was a very ambassadorial statement. But I was wondering, how did you cope with that? How did you get through that period? Or was it not for you then a matter of getting through something? Were you somewhere else by then?
I don't think it hurt me as deeply as it hurt Lindy. But having said that, we both felt very brushed aside and absolutely written out of the history of the band. And I'm not being paranoid when I say that, because it must have been around that time or maybe later that the guy who curates and maintains the GoBetweens official website came to Australia for some reason. I don't know why, maybe just for a holiday. And we met him, and Lindy and I, and he said, what is it like? Why have I been told to take you off all the website and any reference to you, and just not talk to you about you at all? And we went, we kind of thought that was happening, but we didn't know and wondered if we were just being paranoid. So, yeah, it was, there's no doubt about that it felt galling at the time, but by the same token, I had all these other things happening, and I don't think I would have wanted to go back, to be honest. But there was also whole financial side to it, where Lindy and I had to fight just to be paid for the work that we did. And
Right.
contractually we were entitled to be paid, but we weren't being paid.
Right.
And so that was a whole other issue that was equally galling and quite insulting, because it's not even a lot of money, and it's nothing that you're going to retire on, but it's just acknowledging the fact that you did make a contribution in some way. So yeah, it was difficult to see, but in some respects it was also a really motivating force, because it certainly made me approach the path I had taken with renewed drive and vigour, because I just was determined that I would make a life of my own.
Right. And that you mentioned earlier that in, I think that same year, 2000, that's when you graduated?
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Right. Earlier in this discussion, you made reference to the fact that it's only in the last 5 years, I think you said 5-6 years, that you feel that you've been carving out the kind of career that you wanted to carve out and get to the position where you're more comfortable being able to do what you want to do. Just in terms of that recent past, the challenges of how you've got there along the way. So I've read that you were doing all sorts of supplementary work and other kinds of work. So you're doing lots of teaching, and I think you did a stint as a librarian for a time. Again, those challenges, how did you put all that together? And I mean, there seems to be a very singular drive that I will get to do what it is that I'm trying to do, and I'll find a way to cobble all this together.
Yeah, look, we were, I think being around that subculture of the Go-Betweens and the associated bands of the time, people like Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, all of those men had a very singular belief in their own genius, so to speak, and their self-confidence and the fact that they never once questioned what they were doing, even though perhaps it was hard. Maybe, I mean, none of us ever made a lot of money from the Go-Betweens, and we never had hits, and it wasn't about living that rock star life of wealth and renown. But nevertheless, all those male musicians of that era had that self-determination, and I saw that and noticed that that's really what you need to keep going and believe in yourself. And I think that's a harder thing for women to do, because other people don't have that belief in them, or haven't had until recently. The film work was so sporadic.
Yes, and that was the reality. I guess I'm interested in the inner resource to be able to stick with that.
Okay, so yeah, and I think also what I said before, Lindy and I were watching this reincarnated version of the Go-Betweens touring and getting press and never mentioning us in interviews, and I think it just, that gave us a certain drive and determination to succeed at whatever we were doing as well. Mm-hmm. But over the years that's waned, and and this was always there even as a musician in tiny indie bands and in the Go-Betweens, was that desire to just be really good at whatever you do. And when I joined the Go-Betweens, all I wanted was to be a great instrumentalist. I was completely happy not writing songs and not being the star of the show. I just wanted to write great parts and be a good player.
Right. last question on the Go-Betweens, although these questions are really more about you and your reactions to things. There's been I guess from one angle, an explosion of different material being released over recent years around the Go-Betweens, from the documentary Right Here through to the box sets of G stands for Go-Betweens. Is there anything more to say, do you think? Is there going to be, there's a strong appetite for all of this, but in terms of ongoing and different viewpoints, different understandings about the band, it's amazing that the band continues to have this kind of cultural impact, and that people hunger to know more.
It is quite amazing, and I always doubted that would be the case, because from the time I joined the Go-Betweens, we knew we were an on the margins cult band. And this is, again, part of that incredible self-belief that I have to say Lindy had as well. They were always saying things like, we might not have hits, but we're going to be like the Velvet Underground. We're going to be this cult band that in decades to come people will hold in esteem. And I never believed it. And I just thought, no, they're going to forget, and I really can't see that happening. But I don't really care, because let's just make the best records and songs and everything that we can possibly make right now. So it is interesting, and you probably know that Tracy Thorn wrote a book about Lindy, which is very much the feminist interpretation of the story, which needed to be told as well, because Robert had written a very one-sided history.
Yeah, in Grant and I.
Yeah. So, and look, now that I'm working probably equally in the film industry to the music industry, and filmmakers have said to me, this is such a great story, I want to make a film of it. So maybe that will happen. Who knows? Because films are notoriously hard and take a long time to actually come to fruition. But well, I don't know why that interest remains. There's some great songs, but I think people are really invested in the story too, in the similar way that they're fascinated by the Fleetwood Mac inter-band relationships.
Yeah, Fleetwood Mac of Australia, it's sometimes said. In terms of what we do know, just to finish off, we do know that you're working on, and that you have been working on, a new album, 8 Guitars, which is going to come out later this year. Tell me about that project.
8 Guitars is my first solo album, and which is kind of crazy considering my age, but because I'm a menopausal woman of a certain age, I just don't give a shit what people think anymore, basically. And when COVID happened, I envisaged being unemployed for a while, because the whole film industry shut down, the whole music industry shut down. There was nothing going on, people couldn't shoot. So I had this sort of collection of songs that I'd been building up over the years. Some were written for films, some were just written in downtimes between film projects, where I felt like I needed to keep my creative brain muscle match fit. So I wrote songs, and I actually did a sort of a remote, this is pre-COVID, but it's a very COVID thing to do. There was a woman out of New York who was doing a songwriting challenge online, and anybody in the world could do it. And you had to write a song a day for a month. And you didn't have to finish the songs, but you had to do it. And so I did it in a period of downtime, and I think probably 3 or 4 songs on the album have ended up as a result of that discipline of writing a song a day.
Right.
And so I did write 30 songs, but again, because I have no label, I have no manager, I do have an agent for film stuff, but not for this songwriting caper. And I think probably only a few of them were good.
Of the 30 songs.
Of the 30 songs.
Right.
But it was a great thing to do. And so when COVID happened, I thought, I'm going to make an album now, and I'm just going to make it, and I always had this idea that a great show would be, and it was sort of inspired by the GoBetweens shows when we performed 16 Lovers Lane in recent years at arts festivals. And we had these extra musicians who were just beautiful players and really fun to work with. And I love guitar, obviously, but I think guitar is one of those instruments like saxophone. A lot of people play it, but not many people play it tastefully. And I started thinking about my dream guitarists and who I'd like to play on the album, and there were too many of them, so I decided to give each guitarist a song.
Right.
So there's 8 different guitarists and 8 songs, and it's sort of a concept album in that way, I guess, but it's it's acoustic. The Tony Buchan, who produced it, describes it as cosmic Americana.
Wow.
I don't know if that's a genre, but look, I don't know if it's good, but we'll see. We'll see when it comes out.
Sure. Well, Amanda Brown, we wish you all the best with 8 guitars and for your future work in screen performance and composition. And thanks very much for joining us on Monnet Conversations. Thank you.
Thank you.